So Dana, do you want to talk a little bit about why FATCA is important to the operations folks in the room? And
Sure.
Great,
Sure.
thanks.
So like we mentioned before, tax isn't, applying U.S. tax on an income event or a corporate action event isn't new. We've been doing that for some time. And when I think about NRA, I think about, in general, to simplify tax for myself, because I have a corporate action background. When I came into tax, I needed to simplify it. So when I think about NRA, I think about treaties, right? So it makes sense that we would apply tax treaty rates to the payments that we're making to non-resident aliens. And we've been doing that for a while. And the type of payments that are eligible for that type of withholding are, you can typically say frequently paid, i.e. dividends, interest, fixed interest payments that are eligible for that type of withholding. We know that we can have default rules in that regard and have our systems be capable of reading those rules and apply that withholding right up front at the time of the payment. In regards to corporate action and when it comes to reorganization events and some mandatory events, that's the space where, we've been talking about STP and XBRL and, 20022. This is where you lose your STP, right? Because you got to stop and question the event and consider if it's taxable. And if you're looking to provide the transparency and upfront, information to your client, you want to do that before the information goes out the door, or during the time that you have prior to payable date. So if you're doing that, you need to then research that, because that's not a default rule. It's not all corporate action events that are considered taxable for U.S. withholding purposes. So in that regard, you're going to need potentially to go out and make some determinations. You might need legal opinion. You might need to get yourself a vendor that has expertise in this area that can advise you of that, which is what Stevie was talking about initially. Get automation up front. You might get a feed or a vendor feed that might tell you that information during that life cycle of the event. This is generally information that you might be able to find in a company or issuer documentation. Now, we all know it's not easy to get issuers to give you that information. Most of the information that often we're looking for from issuers when it comes to taxability is not anything that we're not there yet. We're not getting that information, so we're stopping and looking. So in that regard, it can be complex due to the lack of STP, and it can be complex because of the nature of the analysis that needs to be done.
That's a great point, Dana. One of the things that I think that's always bothered me, before I started doing all this corporate action stuff at Wolters Kluwer, I represented a lot of investors that held large positions in securities. And there is no legal obligation in most issuer documents for debt. When there's an event, they're not required to tell you specifically what happens or give you a tax opinion unless you're dealing with a tax-exempt municipal bond. And so if you read documents that come out when they ask you to consent to a change in the terms of a debt instrument, there'll be sort of a prophylactic disclaimer that will say something like, well, there might be a tax effect here. Go talk to your own tax advisor. And that'll protect them from Rule 10b-5 risk under U.S. securities law, which is all they care about.
That's right.
And the tax issue about whether or not the instrument's been affected will be your problem. And even before we get into FATCA, you could have a big issue where, what if we had something that tax lawyers think about this all the time in our tax treehouse. We think about the fact that you could have a corporate action that changes a security from debt into equity. And although there are many exemptions from U.S. withholding tax for payments of interest on debt, there is no total exemption from dividends for paid on equities. So even under the old withholding tax rules, these things matter. And they just matter more because of the grandfathering rules we're going to talk about.
So to that point, Stevie, with FATCA, you can't assume on debt like income, interest income, that it is not eligible for FATCA or exempt. In the NRA, the current regime, we have certain presumption rules, which are if you have a documented non-resident alien, you then can presume if, and the debt is, post 1984, and if anybody holds debt prior to that, that's, that's rare. You can presume it's exempt from withholding, but FATCA requires you to look further. It requires you to look at day-to-day and other considerations, to Stevie's point.